Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Crowder's Corner here on LinkedIn. I'm Mike Crowder. For about 10 years now, I have considered myself a progressive independent politically. Much to my dismay, in recent years, a growing number of liberal Democrats in the United States have begun calling themselves progressive. Well, that's not really true in my opinion. Progressive and liberal are not synonymous. They can be, but not necessarily. The word progressive has a different meaning for me than it does for the liberal Democrats who are embracing it as their label, probably because of the negative connotation and stigma attached to the word liberal. And you really can't blame them. But you look at the root of the word progressive. It's progress. That means advancing. That means moving forward. That means implementing positive change. That means embracing new or fresh ideas. And it means thinking outside the box. There are liberals in this country who are in favor of maintaining the status quo. And there are liberals who are progressive. On the other hand, there are conservatives who are progressive, and then others who are in favor of maintaining the status quo. Moderates and centrists, so to speak. The same applies to them. In other words, you can be a progressive and be conservative, liberal, moderate, a centrist, anywhere along the political spectrum. In other words, political ideology has nothing to do with progressivism. Now, as far as being an independent is concerned, I have embraced over the last 5 years in particular the idea of an emerging, viable, competitive third political party in the United States, especially in presidential elections. In presidential elections, we have two choices: the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate, and oftentimes one of those happens to be the incumbent president. Now, of course, they have built-in advantages of incumbency that I'll get into later. But suffice it to say that a country that prides itself on competition and choice provides neither when it comes to presidential politics. It's the two mainstream political parties. And many of us in recent elections in particular, I'll go back to the 2000 election. Since then, in a lot of the elections for president, we've had to hold our noses and vote for lack of a better phrase, the lesser of two evils. Or we vote third party, or we stay at home. And obviously staying at home is not good for our democracy. We need as much voter participation as possible. Now, a third political party, which I'll call the Independent Party, would have its own platform. And some of the issues that I think a third political party, an independent political party, would embrace are as follows. The first is term limits. Members of the U.S. House should be limited to 4 2-year terms. Members of the U.S. Senate should be limited to 2 6-year terms. And if you serve 8 years in the House, you can run for the Senate. If you're elected, you can serve 12 years there. That's 20 years. That's long enough. When you get beyond that, you go from being a citizen legislator, which is what we really need in this country, especially at the federal level, to being a career politician, which we don't need. Now, we also need campaign finance reform, and that's very complicated, but I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. We need limits on contributions to political parties and political campaigns and spending by political parties and political candidates, especially those running for Congress or running for re-election in Congress, and those running for president or re-election as president. Let's face it, money is the crack cocaine of politics. Democrats and Republicans alike are addicted to money. And we should also limit contributions to individuals. No more special interest group money coming from, say, for example, corporations and labor unions who have the ability to contribute millions and millions of dollars to political parties and political campaigns, presidential campaigns, and candidates. And we know that money buys access and influence when it comes to elections and when it comes to lobbying for or against legislation, depending on how it affects you. Now, we also need to repeal lifetime appointments for federal judges and gerrymandering, which is the practice of drawing legislative or congressional districts that benefit one political party or the other at the expense of everybody else. Now, as far as Congress is concerned, we need what I call meaningful ethics reform. And I've got two proposals in that area. One is requiring members of Congress to recuse themselves whenever there is legislation pending that would benefit them or a member of their family. In other words, where they would get some sort of financial return. And if they do vote on such legislation and it passes, becomes law, then they would be required to return that money that they make or their family member makes benefiting off the passage of that particular legislation, return that money to the taxpayers. Now, my other ethics reform proposal, or have I even gotten into ethics reform yet? Yes, I have. When it comes to criminal violations, if a member of Congress is indicted on felony charges or a violation of election laws or campaign finance laws, then they are suspended from their office until they're either exonerated or they're convicted, plead guilty, or no contest. They can get their seat back if they're exonerated. If they plead guilty or no contest or they're convicted, they lose their seat. It's that simple. Now, when it comes to presidential powers, I've got several ideas. One is that presidents should not have the power to pardon, parole, or commute sentences. Far too often, those are doled out to friends, family members, and political allies. Also, there needs to be a significant reduction in the power of the president to issue executive orders. Now, orders that are limited in scope, I'm okay with those. But those that are far-reaching and affect millions of people, those should go through the traditional legislative process. They should be passed by Congress and signed by the president. It's that simple. And then one reform that I favor that would benefit the president is the line item veto. Governors in at least 44 states already have that power. And it would allow the president to veto line item spending on certain projects in spending bills, budgets, or appropriations bills that they feel is a waste of taxpayer money, too expensive, or shouldn't involve federal funds in the first place. Well, that's a synopsis of this week's show. In fact, that is this week's show. And I'm running out of time here as I look at my clock. I have a 10-minute limit here on LinkedIn. But thank you for joining me for this edition of Crowder's Corner on LinkedIn. We'll see you next week, and I hope everybody has a good weekend.